In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential targets such as military bases and chemical plants may be advised to evacuate.
Hello, Sublation Media viewers and readers. It's me again, Douglas Lane, author of Bash Bash Revolution, head of Sublation Media.
And I'm Ashley Farrelly. I'm a sociologist at the University of Kent and co-head of Sublation Media. And I apologize for my terrible sound. It's usually better, but I'm in Canada visiting family and I'm doing the best with what I have.
You sound fine and you look great. And we're going to tackle the question of TikTok and the problem of anti-Semitism on university campuses. In fact, there's a problem of anti-Semitism apparently in both locations. So I just think that it's important to take a look at this question in the context of the war and disinformation. As always.
Now, I'm going to need you to justify that because this has become a bit of an obsession with you and it is not widely shared in our political milieu. So I need to know what the connection is here.
Okay. Well, the connection between TikTok and the war on disinformation or the university?
Yes, because, well, both of these things, because clearly, I mean, if you watch partisan news media, there's a problem on TikTok. Who knows what the young people are getting up to from behind closed doors or in the privacy of their screens. Surely this is a justification for censorship.
Well, no, it's not. But this is happening in the context of the passage of the Digital Services Act in the EU. And before that, the creation of what Michael Schellenberger is calling the censorship industrial complex, which was an attempt by the Department of Homeland Security and other government agencies to control what was said online and the narratives that would dominate both social media and the mainstream media in the United States and around the world. That was exposed by the Twitter files and then the Facebook files and other leaks. Recently, the Cyber Threat Intelligence League documents leaked, showing that not only was there an attempt to control what was said online, but also to infiltrate organizations that were dissident or organizing in protest by the Cyber Threat Intelligence League, which was a volunteer organization peopled by intelligence officers and military personnel and so forth, along with marketers and other typical overproduced elites. But I think that it's important to right now to think about the Digital Services Act because in the context of that act, which stipulates that social media companies have to report in regularly to the EU on their efforts to combat disinformation according to the guidelines drawn up by the EU, guidelines that can be changed, that are I think often aiming at pre-bunking upcoming events, or as well as debunking particular political perspectives that might emerge in response to events. That is the context, the demand by the EU that these companies abide by their terms of service. For the recent flap over anti-Semitism on TikTok, back in October, back in October, the European Union demanded that Facebook or Meta and TikTok both detail their efforts to curb illegal content and disinformation during the Israel-Hamas war, flexing the power of the new law that threatens billions in fines if tech giants fail to do enough to protect users.
Okay, so it's important to get our heads around exactly what this, what the Digital Services Act is, and what's interesting is that there is a partnership, not obviously stated outright, but there is a sort of collusion happening, and there has long been a collusion happening between social media companies and government actors in order to clamp down on free speech online. And it goes back obviously to COVID, this attempt to kind of get ahead of misinformation, even if it was information that was correct, but that was seen to be damaging to an objective on the part of governments. Now, that's something that we should be very, very careful about. I know that there is a kind of a trend on the left to be a bit statist, but we have to understand these are capitalist governments. They do not have our best interests at heart, okay? If it comes between you and the bottom line, it's the bottom line. So it began with COVID. And we need to be very, very careful about this notion that that disinformation or misinformation is the reason why this is happening. It's about governments attempting to control narratives for their own stated endpoints. And I think for a long time, there was this kind of tenuous agreement that the best way, for decades, it kind of held that the obvious idea that sunlight is the best disinfectant, that the best way to combat speech we don't like is counter speech, to speak against it. But as that kind of tenuous agreement gave way, people began to also forget what we now call the Streisand effect. The more that you try to censor and suppress something, so even if you agree, I don't like this information, I don't like this form of communication, you have to understand that the more you try to suppress something, the more you empower it, the more that you embolden it. And there's this sort of widespread idea that if only we had been a little harder on the Nazis, then the Holocaust never would have happened. That's not the case. Censorship of the Nazi Party was actually attempted, and all it did was embolden Hitler. All it did was embolden the Nazis, and it allowed them to pose as renegades against the state, as a dangerous radical force, and it didn't obviously do anything. So there were attempts to clamp down on free speech to prevent Nazi propaganda or whatever Nazi ideas from spreading. It didn't work. Okay, so the more that you try to suppress these ideas, the more that they come back, the more that people are emboldened that, oh, well, this is something that's worth suppressing. The state is afraid of these ideas. Anyways, we have to be careful for a number of reasons about these sorts of things. And the story that's being told, the frame around it, is that as a good sort of reasonable citizen, you should worry about this information. And it's very harmful. No, the big one is, of course, harms to children. And we've talked about framing quite a lot on this channel. And anytime that you can kind of frame an issue as harmful to children, then you give yourself the upper hand, because then anybody who argues against it is suddenly in favor of harming children. See how it works? So they will say, oh, but it's really about, harmful information toward children on the internet. Obviously that exists. Harmful information, harmful communication, of, explicit imagery, that sort of thing. Obviously that exists, and it's something that's very important to try to control, but that is a pretense for other things as well. And that makes it very, very tricky to argue against, and it makes it a very potent force in terms of having this kind of legislation passed. Another one is, hate speech. Again, framed in this way, it's like, oh, well, if you're against it, you must be a hateful person, you must be a bigot, right? So now you have an incentive, or you are disincentivized from arguing against it. And so it's in your interest to just quietly sort of say, yeah, that's fine. And this is how these kinds of highly illiberal forms of legislation ultimately get passed, because the incentive, if you want to be a good person, it's framed in a way that says all good people, all normal thinking human beings who are kind to their pets or whatever, of course, it's just a no-brainer. Of course, you would be in favor of this. And anyone who is against it is obviously hateful, wants to harm children, that sort of thing. This is how claims makers or advocates for something frame things, not in order to like get people excited about it, but to get your passive assent. That's ultimately what people want, and that's how these policies get passed: passive assent, or disincentivizing organized dissent. That is
Right.
it. To organize against it, so then the pathway to policy is not impeded.
What I would add is just that, as if you're part of the left, if you consider yourself to be critical of the current established society and its foundations, wanting to make radical changes, it is worthwhile to think about the history of the way this has developed. I don't think we should trace it back to COVID, but actually probably at least back to the post-World War II Cold War. You can read documents from military intelligence and the Army. I have a manual from Army military intelligence about psyops, and look into the history of psychological warfare and see that it developed out of World War II in response to the Cold War, and that from the beginning, or at least since the 70s, there was a thought that it would certainly be helpful if the military intelligence agencies could deploy the strategies of psychological warfare domestically. And that's been was held back to some degree, and also not held back um, for, off and on since then. I think the other place to look is the war on terror, which was a way to reinvent the Cold War after the collapse of the Soviet Union. I remember Dick Cheney saying the war on terror won't be ending in our lifetimes. It was a way to set up a perpetual apparatus to exert U.S. Power against enemies, both foreign and domestic. And one of the aims at the beginning of the war on terror was to create a Department of Total Information Awareness and to suppress speech in various ways through the Patriot Act. And that continued. The other place to look for this current round of an effort to subvert the Constitution, overturn the Bill of Rights, and turn psychological warfare techniques into a technique for governing, would be Russiagate and the election of Donald Trump, and the creation of the power grab by the Department of Homeland Security to put all of America's communication infrastructure into the hands of the Department of Homeland Security. So what happened was, the Soviet threat was transformed into the threat of terrorism, which was then transformed into the threat of a Manchurian candidate in the form of Donald Trump, which turned out to be a complete lie, of course. And then from there, just the threat of the population itself, the miseducated and reactionary general populace. And so that's I think the very sketchy kind of historical train of events that I would point to explain.
Yeah, and here's the thing, and this is a Žižekian line, but there was always this idea that capitalism and democracy naturally go together. Sure, at a certain point, capitalism needs democracy, but at a certain point, it needs authoritarianism. And I've given this whole spiel before, but empowering people toward democracy was talking about the people was useful in order to fell feudalism to the ground. But of course, the people will begin to want to make real the promises that were given to them when they joined in that battle, and so they will keep taking the fight a bit further. Now, if you want to maintain capitalism, you can't have that. You have to draw very careful limitations, very careful borders around the fight for democracy, to make democracy a real thing. And so it's always being delimited. This is always the sort of dance within capitalism, that you dangle in front of people a certain amount of freedom, but they can never really have it. And so it's never going to be enough for people. Once you give people a taste of freedom, they don't relinquish it, which is it's a good thing, obviously. And so there's always this need then to have a reason, a justification for delimiting, for putting limitations on democracy. And a threat is all, this is what military juntas do. They always say there's some great threat. They big up some threat in society that they're there to protect you from. The military junta doesn't just come in and say, like, screw you guys, we're in power now. They have a justification. They tell a story about why they're there. The threat of communism or whatever it might be. And so authoritarianism needs a threat. And now the threat is, well, not now. I mean, this is the enemy within is an old kind of idea, but now it's the sort of rabble. And what's scary is that a lot of people believe it, that this anti-mass sentiment has become so powerful as part of our cultural milieu that it becomes very difficult to fight against that. But it's important to understand that socialism, communism, these are movements about empowering the masses. It's about believing in everyday people to govern. When Marx and Engels said workers of the world unite, they didn't say after a careful education process, after which you will be empowered to self-govern in ways that are safe and are and healthy for you and those who are connected to you. I don't want to use the word family. No, it was about the people as they are, who are already running the world, mastering its machines, are capable of self-governing. Not after a careful process of meditation and learning to get in touch with yourself. No, the people as they are. So this anti-mass sentiment has become so powerful and so pervasive that this narrative of the threat of democracy is scarcely contested, and that I find very worrying.
Yeah, the other thing that you hear when you try to raise this issue is first of all that you hear, of course, we have to do something about disinformation, and we should address how under the First Amendment disinformation should be dealt with, and then or lies should be dealt with. But so we can come back to that. But the other thing that I often hear is like this: you're overstating the case. This is not a political project. This is not an attempt to circumvent the Constitution and govern through psychological warfare, as I described it earlier. And you're a conspiracy theorist and so on and so forth. But I want to point out that on December 6th, Glenn Greenwald's TikTok for his show System Update was banned from TikTok. The reason given was that his channel had violated TikTok's integrity and authenticity policy. That is, the integrity and authenticity policy is the policy that covers disinformation. It states, we want everyone to feel confident that they can access information that is reliable, discover content that is original, and engage with people who are authentic. This is foundational to building a community of trust and accountability, both on TikTok and off platform. In a global community, it is natural for people to have different opinions, but we seek to operate on a shared set of facts and reality. We do not allow inaccurate, misleading, or false content that may cause significant harm to individuals or society, regardless of intent. Significant harm includes physical, psychological, or societal harm and property damage. It does not extend to commercial or reputational harm, nor does it cover simply inaccurate information and myths. We rely on independent fact-checking partners in our database of previously fact-checked claims to help assess the accuracy of content. The community guidelines page is divided into sections. I can tell you about that. But the point here is that Glenn Greenwald was told that his channel was banned, because he had violated the policies that where disinformation is covered. And that means he was removed as disinformation. Now, Greenwald, as far as I know, is not being supported by some foreign power. And none of the reports or shows that he runs could be have been discredited as false. And it's important to realize that you don't have to be saying things that are actually false for you to fall under the category of misinformation, because it includes a category called malinformation. That is information that's true but leads people to the wrong conclusions. So Greenwald, as far as I can tell, was banned from TikTok for reporting true things that lead people to the wrong conclusions and might damage society. And this is not really being done by TikTok, but by the EU through the Digital Services Act, because TikTok has been called upon to demonstrate its adherence to the new law. And if you throw in the fact that the United States has its own more informal network of censorship and suppression run through NGOs and the intelligence community, and not codified into law. TikTok is banning Greenwald at the request of the United States government and the EU. So that's just, I think I can state that as something close to a fact. Maybe, it requires some interpretation of it and historical context and, extra knowledge to see it clearly. It's not just true on its face, but I think it's a fact that Glenn Greenwald was thrown off TikTok for at the request of the EU and the U.S. government and he's a victim basically of the war on disinformation. So.
Right. So there are a whole lot of comments coming through, and I was trying to pull some of them up. So there was an objection to my statement that that Marx and Engels wanted to empower the masses, and that this is, is the quote comment here, actually is equating Marxism with petty bourgeois social democracy and populism. I had in mind the famous line, "Every cook can govern," that it's not a specialty thing that you have to, anytime that there's like some issue that everyone's talking about, there's inevitably, and it's all over social media and so on, there's inevitably someone will comment, oh, suddenly everyone's a political science major. No, the point is that you don't have to be a political science major in order to engage in democracy. I had in mind the pervasive behavior management of things like nudge, and every social problem comes down to if only people would manage their behavior better, if only they would engage in mindfulness practices, that sort of thing. I have in mind that kind of lack of faith in the human subject, where the human subject is constructed as something that lacks self-control, that lacks an ability to adequately self-govern without the external intervention of technocrats. That's what I had in mind. Obviously, you're going to have, otherwise we wouldn't be here. Like, obviously, there's a certain amount of education and trying to understand one's predicament in order to figure out how to politically organize and to act. That obviously requires a lot of discussion within workers' movements and so on. And that's something that we learn about together through the course of acting and engaging with the world. My brother's become a trade union organizer now, which is very funny. And I've been enjoying the long sort of debates and arguments that I have with my brother about these things. So I'm actually probably going to have on my own podcast soon, because it's like he hates blue-haired intellectuals. And yet we agree with each other on so much and have a ton to learn from each other. But he cannot ever sort of imagine that we can agree on these things. We have to argue for 45 minutes before we can come to the fact that we actually agree. Anyways, that's just my sort of aside in saying that through these sort of discussions and debates, we are educated and we come to know how to act in the world, and also through acting in the world, reflecting on how we've acted, reflecting on past struggles and so on. I'm railing against the kind of top-down imposition of behavior management strategies, is that then eventually you will be able to self-govern. If you go on my own YouTube, just a little plug there, Ashley A. Frowley on YouTube, you see that I talk about this all the time in relation to Indigenous people, which I see as a kind of microcosm, where Indigenous people have like self-determination as being the demand for a very long time. And this is continuously put off to the day when we will supposedly, through intervention and psychological therapies and so on, be able to self-govern. Then maybe, so the Indigenous subject gets constructed as increasingly weak. I think that's a microcosm for a broader process that's happening in society, where the democratic subject is increasingly disempowered. Oh, do we really have democracy? There's a whole thing called neuropolitics now, which is the application of supposed neuroscience to politics, which diagnoses our political predicaments as through a kind of medicalized language. So 2016 comes to be understood, Trump and Brexit come to be understood through these sort of eternal psychological mistakes that happen within the human brain. That's the sort of thing I had in mind. And against that, we must pose the notion every cook can govern. Okay.
Yeah, I want to address a comment here not from this one. No, wait a minute. What happened?
No, sorry. I meant to hide that one. I put that up because Eli says there's a thing called what now? Yes.
Okay, Secret Agent Dan, of our nemesis, our gadfly,
our foil, who's very helpful in that sense.
Yeah, by saying that, quoting me to, I think, question me. He said, because I said that the Glenn Greenwald was removed from TikTok, banned from TikTok at the request of the EU and the US government. So I just want to go over the facts again briefly. The European Union demands from social media companies in general, first of all, that they abide by the Digital Services Act, which requires them to report in on their efforts to combat disinformation per the guidelines and thereby the terms of service created by the EU. They also specifically demanded that Meta and TikTok detail their efforts to curb illegal content and disinformation during the Israeli-Hamas war. That's, I think, so that is a request from the EU to TikTok to abide by terms of service standards for censorship on the topic of the Israeli-Hamas conflict. And then TikTok introduced measures, this has been reported by The Jurist, to combat the spread of violent and misleading content associated with the Israeli-Hamas conflict. The platform enhanced its automated detection systems to identify and remove graphic and violent content in real time, ensuring the safety of both its moderators and community members. What should be noted here is that the label violent has been added to the label of disinformation, but violent content could be removed based on old terms of services. That's not a question. The question here is about what counts as disinformation, which is included in their terms of service now, and which the EU is in charge of defining, along with the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, Global Engagement Center, and a variety of nonprofits and NGOs that are working for those institutions. So it is just the case that a request was made of TikTok to abide by the Digital Services Act, specifically on the question of disinformation regarding the Israel-Hamas conflict, and that TikTok reported that it had enhanced its algorithm in order to suppress content that might be misleading regarding that Israel-Hamas conflict, and again, by the terms defined by a variety of disinformation institutions. There is a category called malinformation, which has been censored in the past. So even though Glenn Greenwald is often, or almost, is very meticulous and diligent in trying to report the truth, nonetheless, he could still be considered disinformation for reporting the truth. And we should recall the suppression of the letter to America from Osama bin Laden, and how it going viral on TikTok led to its removal from The Guardian, and so on. So, I mean, I think it's clear that Glenn Greenwald was removed at the request of the EU and the United States as a part of the war on disinformation. That he was not given any other reason for his removal but for his violation of the terms of service regarding disinformation. So that, I think, is, as far as anything can be, an established fact, or at least in as far as anything can be in this regard. It's worth looking at this clip. I have a clip of Elon Musk talking to the head of a member of the EU who headed up the Digital Services Act, and here he is.
So we are in Austin together with Elon Musk. Thank you very much, Elon, for welcoming me.
Thank you. Most welcome.
And of course, we discussed many issues, and I was happy to be able to explain to you the DSA,
yes.
A new regulation in Europe. And I think that now you understand very well. It fits pretty well with what you think we should do on a platform.
No, I think it's exactly aligned with my thinking. I think I very much agree with. It's been a great discussion, and I really think I agree with everything you said. Really, I think we're very much of the same mind, and I think just anything that my companies can do that would be beneficial to Europe, we want to do that. I just want to say.
No, thank you very much. That's again a good example. And when we see that there could be some differences, especially when we are speaking things so important for our fellow citizens,
yes,
as in life and the digital space, the best is to come and discuss. This is what we did, and I'm happy to see that we align.
Sounds good.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So there's Maverick Elon Musk agreeing to abide by the Digital Services Act, and as you know, I think you can see from his posture and his demeanor there, which is rather unique for him, that he's being deferential to the EU. He wants to go along to get along. Europe is a large market for Twitter. Doesn't want to see X, I guess, taken down across Europe. So it's not really a question as to whether or not the EU is doing this. They are doing this, and they're doing it and publicizing their efforts. What's different about Europe in general and the EU and the United States is that Europe isn't protected by the First Amendment. The free speech protections across European nations are muddled and varied and mostly pretty weak. So they are able to codify this suppression in a way that cannot yet be done in the United States. But nonetheless, it's happening in both places. So,
well, I mean, the European Union did elect a former Nazi as one of its first leaders. So what do you expect?
yeah.
This wonderful bastion of freedom. No. So you mentioned before, like how should disinformation be dealt with?
Well, I mean, we should call it lies instead of disinformation, because disinformation is a term of art from psychological warfare, or from the battlefront. And I think that back in the old days, when I first was on the internet, it was kind of common knowledge that anyone could post, and that people would say whatever they believed without fact checking very often, getting their facts often wrong. I recall that I myself would from time to time spout off on things I knew nothing about and get things wrong. And it was sort of just assumed that if you're on Facebook or Twitter, or back in the day LiveJournal or somebody's blog, that you might be better off double checking that. If you really cared about it, go to the library, go do some research, ask people who were educated on the subject, and you shouldn't treat Twitter as if it's a news outlet. I mean, it may be news outlets use it to link to their publications, but it is a particular space where anything kind of goes. There's a Wild West atmosphere there, and
That's
buyer
great.
beware.
Yeah, I mean, it's always worthwhile to double check things and to cross-reference. I mean, for me, this is kind of it's second nature to me, and it's a bit worrying as deadlines become very deadlines multiply, that my typical careful writing, sometimes I have caught a mistake right before it goes to print, which is really scary. These sorts of things, they happen, and it's worthwhile to just double check if something seems, if a number appears to be nice round numbers, this sort of thing. Reality very rarely has nice round numbers. So about this many people have been harmed by this problem. If the number seems too large, it's worthwhile to double check. So yeah, it's worthwhile to have a few tips and tricks up your sleeve to recognize when something may not be true, or when something may be framed in a particular way that invites you to think about things in a way that is beneficial to the speaker. On the other hand, I think the major way in which disinformation should be dealt with is simply more speech, more discussion, more openness to having more speech and more discussion. Because I think what worries me a lot of the time is that people move to suppressing speech because they have lost faith in themselves. I think trying to suppress speech betrays a lack of faith in one's own ideas. And people will kind of squirm out of this and say, well, no, I'm not going to give these ideas a platform and therefore give them any kind of legitimacy. Yes, but suppressing them also gives them legitimacy. It makes them seem dangerous. And people who know what they're doing and have played this like a fiddle, Andrew Tate knew exactly that by pissing people off, they boosted his, but the more that people tried to suppress him, the more they boosted his signal. And we should learn our lesson by now. And I think also it betrays a kind of the thinness of some of the ideologies that go straight to censorship. It's not a kind of robust way of thinking. It's not a set of robust arguments. It's something that has been sort of absorbed through the ether in a series of statements that you just kind of have to accept are true. And if I say these couple of statements, I'll be fine on this particular topic, And then it's not well thought through. It's not something that can be argued about. And so people avoid argument and seek to sort of name call and suppress speech. And I think that is not good for public debate, not good for public discussion. And the policies that arise out of that are not good for democracy.
I totally agree. And the other thing to remember is that when we empower bodies like the EU or Department of Homeland Security to decide what counts as disinformation and to control the flow of information, we are empowering them to have a lot of power to lie and to create their own false narratives and enforce them. So, that has happened over and over again. The examples that come to mind first would be from the period of the COVID pandemic, where it was claimed that if you got the vaccine, you would definitely not get COVID, for instance, and that was a line that everyone had to, repeat. There was a suppression of information about the side effects of the vaccines. There were a variety of ways in which the data and the debates were suppressed in order to enforce a policy that had already been determined by the government and couldn't be questioned. And it probably had a very detrimental effect on a lot of people. It certainly would have been better for open debate to be allowed and for the policies to be able to be questioned. And even if sometimes those who would be doing the questioning would get things wrong, maybe intentionally or not, it would be better to have a access to a multitude of liars than only one liar who has one agenda. So I just think that we have to, on the left, embrace the idea that a free and open discourse, a free and open press, and is required, is necessary, is worth defending, and also recognize when it is being undermined. In the case of Glenn Greenwald, this is a guy who broke the Edward Snowden story. He exposed the corrupt use of the judiciary in Brazil. He has a long record of providing dissident but accurate journalism, and he is being suppressed from one major social media platform, and who knows where that will end. The other thing to understand is that his primary platform, Rumble, is being targeted by the EU and the UK's Parliament. I know that for a fact. And there's I believe, and this is not something that I have spent enough time to document that I could say is an established fact, but I believe that the campaign to boycott Rumble, the campaign to get advertisers to drop their advertising from Rumble, is orchestrated by the state as a part of the war on disinformation. And I think that same thing's happening right now with Twitter. I'm not a big fan of Elon Musk. He's not a very consistent free speech advocate at all, but his mercurial and inconsistent approach to moderating and curating content on Twitter allows more to get through than the disinformation warriors would like, and they're targeting him right now as well. So leftists should oppose that, and and we should also recognize what the consequences are when we fail to oppose that. And one of the consequences are that people like Seymour Hersh and Glenn Greenwald are not able to get true stories about war crimes, for instance, out. So and also in the context of the war in Israel, between Israel and Hamas, it is quite clear that the pro-Israel side of American politics has control, has the reins, is guiding the efforts to combat disinformation, and that the faction within the Democratic Party that, let's say, prioritizes the liberation of the Palestinian people, is under attack and being suppressed, and being suppressed online, on social media, and being suppressed in universities as well.
Right. So do you want to go to what's happening in universities? I have more to say
Yeah,
about these things.
no, that's a segue
That
to the
was your
university.
segue, yeah.
That was 40 minutes. We're 40
Okay.
minutes in, so might as well.
Yeah. Okay. So, unless you've been living under a rock, you may not have heard that there was a row about whether or not it is anti-Semitic to, sorry, not whether or not it's anti-Semitic, whether or not anti-Semitic speech is a violation of university policy. And there was a lot of reluctance to say that it was. And this was sort of lampooned on SNL over the weekend, causing even more of a stir. This is becoming a huge issue because, as I keep saying, when the left gave up on free speech, they bequeathed that to the right. But the right were never going to be, they're always going to be fair weather guardians of free speech. So now there's a massive push to sort of give university administrators a taste of their own medicine, to discipline them. Now, while I think they were extremely cowardly, I think it's a problem to start to use cancel culture to get what you want in this particular instance as well. You see this happening all the time, where they're like, we should treat them the exact same way they treated us. We should treat them the exact same way. So now we have an opportunity. We've got the upper hand. We're going to crush them. This is why it is, I'm not a fan of quoting Max Weber, but Max Weber is one of the most that, we teach Durkheim, Marx, and Weber in the first year of sociology for a reason. And Weber said that in democratic societies, you need policy has to have legitimacy. You need some kind of legitimacy. And there are all kinds of different forms of legitimacy. But if you attempt to use naked power to get what you want, when you are in a situation where you no longer have the upper hand, your enemy will use it against you. And this is not conducive to a vibrant democracy, where certain groups have given up on debate, given up on any kind of consensus, on any kind of, there are when there's a disagreement, there are all kinds of potential outcomes, right? One is consensus, one is bargaining, and the other is naked power. We have given up on the idea that we can bargain, that we can, give some things away. We've given up on the idea that we can come to any kind of agreement. So what do? This is our politics today. This is the sort of factionalism and the playing politics like a team sport. I've been criticized for saying that recently. We'll talk about that in the Patreon. Anyways, this is what I mean by playing politics like a team sport. You simply attempt to crush the other side when you have the upper hand. And this is what we see happening now. And we empowered the other side to do that because that was the game we decided we needed to play.
I want to address this question here briefly before we move on to someone asked regarding Musk and Twitter, shouldn't the left oppose the ownership of social media companies by private capitalists in the capitalist states? I think that if a left existed that could organize politically the aim of turning social media companies into a true public service, not controlled by the state, that transparently run, would be worthwhile. But in this moment where that's not on the table, to choose to oppose Musk as a particular owner of social media, as the worst of the offender, I think is a mistake, given that he is in a very inconsistent way, showing some signs of wanting to allow actual free debate to occur, at least on the days of the week when one of his personalities is dominating over the other. I mean, he's very schizophrenic on this question. But it all is also the fact that Musk is being targeted in a way that Meta, and even TikTok are not, precisely because he's speaking about free speech, and also because he allowed for the internal documents from Twitter to be exposed, exposing the intricacies and the unconstitutional nature of the war on disinformation. So it's just it's not so simple. But yeah, I mean, if you want to have a maximal aim, then sure, we should be aiming to overturn the private ownership of what is actually the public square, the digital public square. Yes, but in this particular moment, we should be able to see that the attacks on Musk are not being done because he's a capitalist, but because he is exposing the truth about the war and disinformation. But I want to go back to back on the university subject. You made a good point, which is that this is something that's very obvious, that the attempts to censor speech and to use force rather than reason to control what people say on university campuses, and to kind of enforce a particular ideological line on university campuses is now being turned against those campuses. There was a hearing where the presidents of Harvard, MIT, and Penn State were kind of put on trial in a sense, or at least forced to answer questions. It started out with footage being shown of protests at Harvard, MIT, and Penn State, where students shouted like "Long live the Intifada," "Globalize the Intifada," "Free Palestine," and so on. And these were deemed to be anti-Semitic protests, and the students who participated the presidents were called upon to take action against the students who participated. Of course, the Intifada, the term simply means rebellion or resistance. You have to put it into historical context to claim that it might be anti-Semitic, but even then it's unclear. The histories of the Intifadas included rioting, suicide bombings, and most recently the terrorist attack of October 7th. But those who call for resistance or rebellion are not necessarily endorsing any of those tactics. And even if they were, under the First Amendment, they would have the right to on a college campus as students with free speech rights. But the policies of these universities are kind of internally conflicted. They want to have the free exchange of ideas, but also create a safe working environment or safe educational environment for their students, and can target speech that might be considered offensive in a particular way to people who fall under a list of around 11 political categories, or protected categories. I'm sorry. So people who are over 40, people of different races, people of various of either sex, or if you're a veteran or you have a disability. All these are reasons for you to claim harassment based on speech being offensive. And this means that Jewish people on college campuses who might be offended by calls for globalizing the Intifada might have grounds to claim that they're being harassed.
So yeah, I think Kushluk, one of our commenters, has made a good point. He says, he or she, I'm not sure, they. I think the joke is that they're endlessly free speech policing unless it is certain things they're afraid to oppose, or if it is certain speech this is the inconsistency that happens all the time, right? You can say the most hateful things possible, really awful fucking stuff, as long as you are on the side of something that is perceived to be good and progressive. So you can then be extremely awful about things. And so the point is that people endlessly were talking about like, well, they can do what they want. They can censor whatever they want because they're a private institution or because they have these policies, or they can disinvite speakers, they can blah, blah, blah. Then suddenly you want to say something that you feel is correct and is transgressive. And then you get censored and you're like, oh no, well, what ground do you have to stand on then? Right? Either we consistently apply these rules to everyone and shut down free speech that we don't like, or just to shut it down. And you only allow speech within certain predetermined areas that are conducive to safety, which by the way is nothing, which is one of the problems when you start to legislate for psychological harm, which was in that list that you gave earlier. It's extremely difficult to define what that means. It's subjective, really, really dangerous territory. Or you have to allow free speech. And this is the problem. Allowing free speech doesn't mean nothing bad will ever happen. It doesn't mean that people are always going to use their speech in effective ways. But that's not what free speech is about. Free speech is not only about good speech or progressive speech or speech that moves forward an argument. It's also about pointless speech. It's bad taste. That is all part of free speech. It's free speech is for your enemies and it's for you. You've got to take the good with the bad. It doesn't mean, as I said, nothing bad will ever happen, but that policing it is worse.
Yeah, and it's worth pointing out that Harvard is financially funded by the federal government, and that there are many that it's trying not only to abide by its own
psychological harm, I'm sorry, is subjective. It is subjective. I am psychologically harmed by your comment. I feel it in my heart and my soul. You have psychologically harmed me, Political Economy 101. Yes, it is. Psychological harm is subjective. Sorry. Well, anyway, that really pissed me off, and I'm psychologically harmed now.
Okay. No, but the Harvard is federally funded, and also there are civil rights laws that apply to educational facilities to protect people from discrimination, which they are abiding by, and that also there are their own internally constructed policies around DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. So all of these things are factors in the federal government's interest in how the universities are responding to the protest against Israel's bombing of Gaza, and some of the protests are in support of Hamas, and so it's in that context it's that context which challenges the left to reconsider some of its commitments, especially when they're aligned with the president of Harvard, the way in which diversity, equity, and inclusion has been taken up within the so-called Marxist left should be questioned and interrogated, not rejected out of hand, but rethought, given the contradictions that we're seeing right now. I want to show a rather long clip from the hearing. Can I do that? Do we have time for that? Okay, here we go.
Our commitment to
it's
free
a yes
speech.
Or no question. Is that corrected? Is that okay for students to call for the mass murder of African Americans at Harvard? Is that protected free speech?
Our commitment to free speech.
It's a yes or no question. Let me ask you this. You are president of Harvard, so I assume you're familiar with the term intifada, correct?
I've heard that term, yes.
And you understand that the use of the term intifada in the context of the Israeli-Arab conflict is indeed a call for violent armed resistance against the state of Israel, including violence against civilians and the genocide of Jews. Are you aware of that?
That type of hateful speech is personally abhorrent to me.
And there have been multiple marches at Harvard with students chanting, quote, "There is only one solution, intifada revolution," and, quote, "globalize the intifada." Is that correct?
I've heard that thoughtless, reckless, and hateful language on our campus, yes.
So based upon your testimony, you understand that this call for intifada is to commit genocide against the Jewish people in Israel and globally, correct?
I will say again, that type of hateful speech is personally abhorrent to me.
Do you believe that type of hateful speech is contrary to Harvard's code of conduct, or is it allowed at Harvard?
It is at odds with the values of Harvard.
Can you
But
not
our
say here that it
values
is against the
also-
code of conduct at Harvard?
We embrace a commitment to free expression, even of views that are objectionable, offensive, hateful. It's when that speech crosses into conduct that violates our policies against bullying, harassment,
Does that speech
and
not
intimidation.
cross that barrier? Does that speech not call for the genocide of Jews and the elimination of Israel?
When
You
that speech-
testify that you understand that is the definition of intifada. Is that speech according to the code of conduct or not?
We embrace a commitment to free expression and give a wide berth to free expression, even of views that are objectionable.
You and I
outrageous,
both know
and
that's not the
offensive.
case. You are aware that Harvard ranked dead last when it came to free speech. Are you not aware of that report?
As I observed earlier, I reject that characterization.
It's the
of our
data shows
campus.
it's true. And isn't it true that Harvard previously rescinded multiple offers of admissions for applicants and accepted freshmen for sharing offensive memes, racist statements, sometimes as young as 16 years old? Did Harvard not rescind those offers of admission?
That long predates my time as president.
But you
so I can't
understand
speak.
that Harvard made that decision to rescind those offers of admission.
I have no reason to contradict the facts as you present them here.
Correct, because it's a fact. You're also aware that a Winthrop House faculty dean was let go over who he chose to legally represent, correct? That was while you were dean.
That is an incorrect characterization of what transpired.
What's the characterization?
I'm not going to get into details about a personnel matter.
Well, let me ask you this. Will admissions offers be rescinded or any disciplinary action be taken against students or applicants who say, from the river to the sea or intifada, advocating for the murder of Jews?
As I've said, that type of hateful, reckless, offensive speech is personally abhorrent to me.
And today that
When-
no action will be taken. What action will be taken?
When speech crosses into conduct that violates our policies, including policies against bullying, harassment, or intimidation, we take action, and we have robust disciplinary processes that allow us to hold individuals accountable.
What action has been taken against students who are harassing and calling for the genocide of Jews on Harvard's campus?
I can assure you we have robust
What
disciplinary
actions have been
processes
taken? I'm not
with
asking.
actions underway.
I'm asking what actions have been taken against
Given-
those students.
Given students' rights to privacy and our obligations under FERPA, I will not say more about any specific cases other than to reiterate that processes are ongoing.
So, I mean, what you can see there, I think, is that that the lack of free speech and the use of the diversity, equity, and inclusion policies to punish students and faculty alike for their speech is turning around on these presidents of the universities in a moment where there is no consensus as to what really constitutes hateful speech, and powerful people within the state and within society are offended by what other powerful people or at least relatively privileged Harvard University students are wanting to say. And so you've got, and it's also, this is a division within the Democratic Party as well. Different constituencies are in conflict with each other, and without any kind of universal standard of free speech, and with these kind of draconian, backwards penalties for speech being commonplace on university campuses, this is the kind of result that you get. And I guess 2 of the 3 university presidents have resigned since the hearing. Claudia Gay was not one of them. But yeah, I just think this should be a teachable moment for leftists where we try to re-embrace the primary concept of defending a free and open society where the First Amendment prevails and so on and so forth.
I think also part of this is giving speech too much causal power. And I don't have time to go into that point, but you cannot suppress the things that lead to speech by suppressing the speech itself. Let me explain that, but we got to get to the Patreon.
We should, but I want to know why this guy here says I'm a quack. What did I say?
I don't know if this person is,
I'm
not sure if this person is a troll or not, because they're saying things. I think that they might be like a right winger posing as a socialist, to, you know what I mean? Because they keep saying like, oh, it's totally fine to police free speech as long as it helps socialists and stuff like that. And it just seems too caricatured to me. So I'm not sure if it's actually a real person. Sorry if you are.
Okay, well, I'm being trolled. I'm being trolled. All right, so let's jump off here, and I will put a link to the Patreon where we'll be talking about these same issues a little bit more, plus our usual grumbling about how we've been misrepresented and on the left, and how people need to understand us and the nuances and blah blah blah.
We got a bit of a critique in a Scottish magazine. Oh, sorry, I should say the exact Contour magazine by David Jameson, who I actually really like. So I felt that one. That hurt me. All right, so we're going to respond to that and clarify, because it seems that he just kind of responded to the headline, and that there was another critique, and I'm not going to say who the person was because I'm not going to give her any air. But she's like,
you gendered her though.
She's like, she takes up my essay for Compact magazine. Is like, spent like 2 hours criticizing it. She goes, oh, she says that it's like Carnival. We're just supposed to take her word for it. And you can see on the screen, there's literally a fucking hyperlink that goes to a 5,000 word essay on what Carnival is. So I'm not click the damn source, woman. I wrote the essay as well. All right, so let's bitch about that in the Patreon.
Yeah. We're gonna go over to the Patreon where we will be thin-skinned and whine. Enjoy us over there. Thanks for watching us here, and I'll put a link to the Patreon in the description and in the comments for this video.
In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people